Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Guardian Druid in Dragonflight Season 2. As the video title says, this is the best tank you're not playing this season. Now obviously some of you are, and feel free to say that in the comments section. I encourage it. I intended for this video to come out at the start of Season 2, but I just ran out of time, and I'm kind of glad that I did because Bear has really proven this season that it's fun and powerful. A lot more than people expected coming into the season, including myself. Despite the buffs that Bear's received in late Dragonflight Season 1, it's still one of the least popular tanks in the game. If you look at websites like Raider.io and Warcraft logs, you'll find that in Mythic Plus, from around the 14 to 20 range, it's in 5th place in terms of popularity, only ahead of Brewmaster Monk. Once you move into the 20 to 24 range, where things start to get a little harder, a little more competitive, it's still only around 4th place, tied with Brewmaster Monk. You know, right in that 4th to 5th place spot, and basically only ahead of Prot Warrior. Once you get into the plus 25 range, the true top of the competitive level of Mythic Plus pushing, Bear Druid shows off its incredible strength, catapulting ahead of Monk and Blood DK and clearly establishing itself as a top-tier tank just like Paladin and Demon Hunter. In raids, Bear Druid is the least popular tank, but it deals a lot of damage, it's easy to play effectively, and it actually has one of the best defensive toolkits in the game for dealing with boss mechanics in Aberrus. So why is Bear Druid unpopular? I think it really comes down to two main reasons. First, it was undertuned at the start of the expansion. It was really good all the way up through the beta, and then it got nerfed right as the expansion went live during the opening Mythic 0 weeks. It got buffed later in the season, but that's not a super appealing proposition for a lot of players, especially considering the buffs seemed kinda small at the time. A few more seconds of defensive cooldown uptime here, a little bit of armor there. Does that all really sound like it adds up to a lot? It wasn't a full-scale rework. But actually it has been really good. You can get close to 45% uptime on Bark Skin, which is a pretty strong defensive cooldown, on par with the likes of Dampen Harm and Icebound Fortitude, depending on how your talents are set up. The second reason is the bigger hurdle to get over. It doesn't have the right type of group utility for raid. Now I think Bear Druid's group utility is very underrated. You have massive group healing thanks to After the Wildfire. You're basically a walking healing tide totem in the tank position, and this is a huge source of value in Mythic Plus. I've carried plenty of groups in which the healer died, disconnected, or was just dealing with some kind of mechanic by being able to hit everyone in the group with a 100 to 250,000 point AoE heal every 10 to 20 seconds. It's nice. Your other group utility comes mostly in the form of AoE CCs like Incapacitating Roar, Typhoon, Ursol's Vortex, or in things like Mark of the Wild, Innervate, and Stampeding Roar. These are all great tools. The problem is none of them are specific to bears. Balanced Druids and Resto Druids can bring all of these tools too, and finding room for a Balanced Druid or a Resto Druid in your raid is usually pretty easy. That's especially true when you compare it to finding room for a Windwalker or a Mistweaver Monk or a Havoc Demon Hunter. So if you're devoting a tank slot to a Monk or a DH, and Prot Paladin is still undeniably awesome best tank in the game, that doesn't leave a lot of room for Bear Druids. That doesn't mean Bear Druid is bad. Bear Druid is good. It just gets squeezed out of a lot of raid spots due to debuff matrix pressure. Basically, it's Windwalker's fault. Because it's not as popular of a tank to run in raid because it just doesn't mesh as well in terms of the debuff matrix, it's not as popular across the board in Mythic Plus. Most people aren't having a character devoted solely to Mythic Plus. But maybe they should, because Bear Druid is my favorite tank to play right now. I feel tankier on a Bear Druid than I do on any other class. I feel like I do more to help the group succeed in Mythic Plus on Bear Druid than any other class, and I just really think it's more fun than any other class. But wait, there's more. Bear Druid is getting a nice big set of buffs in patch 10.1.5 that are kind of flying in under the radar. Their single target damage is getting a direct buff. Their AoE damage potential is getting a really nice buff. And I think that Bear Druid is not only a good underrepresented tank right now, I think it's going to see a huge spike in power when that patch lands in mid-July. I think Bear Druid is going to go from a underappreciated off-meta tank to just a regular good meta tank. And that means everyone who got on the Bear Druid train early will be ahead of the curve when it comes to getting up to speed on that new meta-defining tank. Alright, now let's do the guide thing where I actually tell you how it plays and how you play it. Some of this will change a bit in patch 10.1.5, and I will point out those bits as I get to them. I didn't want to do a patch 10.1.5 guide yet because, while that stuff is very exciting, one, it's not out yet, and two, it's still subject to change. So anyway, let's get into it. How does Bear Druid play? It's still pretty simple. If Brewmaster Monks are the insanely complex, high-risk, medium-reward tank on one end of the spectrum here, I think Bear Druid is sitting on the exact opposite end. Low risk, high reward. That's a perfect bargain. You deal a mix of direct physical damage, bleed damage, and spell damage. You have a surprisingly weak self-heal and frenzied regeneration, but you have a great collection of damage reduction tools in the form of Iron Fur, Tooth and Claw, Scintillating Moonlight, and Bark Skin. You have layers upon layers of damage mitigation, and that really makes you feel like a brick wall compared to a lot of other tanks. It's a bit like playing a Prot Warrior was in Season 1, except where Prot Warrior would get turned into dust whenever it came up against a source of damage it couldn't block. Bear Druid just never has that problem. The highs aren't quite as high, but the lows are nowhere near as low, and that's actually a great trade when you're tanking. Being consistently good defensively is a lot more important than being really, really strong some of the time at the expense of being weak at other points. Now, I said the Frenzied Regeneration is really weak, and while a major Frenzied Regen talent is being buffed in patch 10.1.5, Bear Druid already has great self-healing. After the Wildfire is an absolutely insane healing talent. Every time you spend 200 rage, so basically every 5 or 6 Iron Fur Maul casts, you do a 15-yard supernova that deals an absolutely enormous amount of healing to players within that range. It's capped at 5 targets, despite that number not being in the tooltip. You can regularly out-heal the group's healer and pulls. I've out-healed healers for entire dungeon runs. That's not to dunk on those healers, it's just to say that as a Bear Druid, you're making the group's lives a lot easier. By doing all that healing, you're not just making it easier for the healer to keep the group alive, the most obvious thing, you're also giving them time to focus on dealing with mechanics like Afflicted or Bursting, or just to deal more damage if there's nothing else going on. That's great. Also, just by keeping everybody healed up, you really do make the game way easier for everyone else. People get nervous when they're at half health, and nervous people make stupid mistakes. I've found this to be the case a lot when playing like Dark Souls games. When I'm fighting a boss and I'm at full health, it's just so much easier to play well than when I'm at half health, even if it's the same fight with the same mechanics and all the same timings, because it's just harder to keep your composure and not panic when you know that one mistake will spell death. The next section in my document here is titled, What are Bear Druids good at? And in the interest of not repeating everything I've already said in the last 2 sections, I'll just say everything. Next section. Now let's talk about Bear Druid's tier set bonuses. They're pretty good and they're basically passive. They don't really change your talents or playstyle in a meaningful way, they just reward you with more damage, more healing, and more rage for playing correctly. Oh, and more health too. Isn't that great? Now, just like the Season 1 bonuses, the Season 2 bonuses have a lot going on in each bonus. You're basically getting 2 for the price of 1 with each of them, so 4 for the price of 2. The 2-piece bonus makes it so that when you take damage, you gain 15% more rage generation from Mangle and Thrash, your 2 main rage generators. You gain 15% more Mangle damage and 15% more Thrash damage, and that all lasts for 8 seconds. It also makes it so that you heal for 6% of all the damage you take over 8 seconds. That's a lot going on in that one talent bonus. It's good and it basically is passive, it's just a lot. Now this doesn't actually trigger from all sources of damage taken, unfortunately. Normal stuff like auto attacks, spell casts, direct damage focused at you will trigger this. And when you're in Mythic Plus, you basically just have 100% uptime on this buff. You can kind of not think about it. It'll always be active. But in Raid, it won't always be active. There are things like passive raid damage, fire damage auras from bosses, or say standing in a trap on Skarn, the dot from Magmarax's tank bite. Those kind of things won't refresh this buff. There's not really anything you can do about it. It's not really a huge deal either. It's just something that you might notice while tanking. You won't generate quite as much rage or do quite as much damage when the other tank taunts off of you. The 4-piece bonus is a little simpler, but again, it's a 2-for-1 deal. Maul deals 20% more damage, that's great, and casting Iron Fur or Maul increases your maximum health by 3% for 12 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. You'll be casting Maul or Iron Fur often enough while tanking that this buff will be at 5 stacks pretty much all of the time outside of the starts of pulls or during boss transition phases. That basically just means it's a free 15% max health and a 20% boost to your Maul damage. Both of those are amazing. One extra little 10.1.5 note, that Maul damage also applies to Raise, and with Raise potentially becoming a lot more usable and powerful in the next patch, this tier set bonus stands to be part of what will send Bear Druid's AoE damage skyrocketing once that patch lands. In any case, this is a really, really strong pair of bonuses, and I would wear the 4-piece at all costs. I would give up item level to get the 2-piece and the 4-piece bonuses. They're both passive, they don't really change your playstyle or your talents, but they are great and they make you a lot stronger. Definitely worth getting. Alright, now let's move on to talents. Alright, here I have a Mythic Plus talent setup and a Raid talent setup that I want to go through. And these aren't exactly a strict Mythic Plus Raid divide. I've used both of these in both of those situations. The Mythic Plus talent setup is really just more oriented about being defensive against physical damage. It's also very effective against magic damage, but it's really oriented toward mitigating as much physical damage as you possibly can. That does make it great in Mythic Plus. It's still really good in Raid too, though. Like, the difference between the quote-unquote Mythic Plus and Raid talent setups here is not that huge in Raid, like, offensively. It's just that you gain a little bit more damage in the quote-unquote Raid talent setup compared to the Mythic Plus one, at the expense of some lost physical damage, but you actually gain some self-healing. So let's kind of run through these talent setups now. A lot of this stuff will be the same between the two. You know, you're taking Frenzied Regen, you're taking Improved Bark Skin, Iron Fur, all these essentials. Well-honed Instincts, Heart of the Wild, Innervate, all this kind of good stuff that you want to have in any situation. Now, one wiggle room talent that I have here is Verdant Heart. This is a great defensive talent, 20% more healing taken during Frenzied Regen and Bark Skin. Personally, I like to drop it and take Wild Charge whenever I'm doing anything. I really just like to have Wild Charge. It's kind of a safety blanket for me, security blanket. That is, I never want to give that talent up. But most players don't play that way. Most players are willing to give up that extra safety mobility to have this constant or very high uptime, really strong healing intake increase. And I mean, I think that's the right call for most players most of the time. In the right-hand tree, we have this trifecta of talents here that I really want to emphasize, because that's really the difference between the two builds. You have Ursoc's Endurance, which increases your Bark Skin uptime by 2 seconds. That's not that huge of a deal, but it is nice, especially when you factor in some of the other talents that are affecting it, like Verdant Heart and Reinforced Fur, which increases the damage reduction of Bark Skin. So you're getting 14 seconds per cast on Bark Skin uptime. Pretty good, especially with the cooldown being as low as it is. 36 seconds, I believe. Yep, 32 seconds even. Wow. Yeah, 14 seconds of uptime, 32-second cooldown. Pretty great. The real value here, though, is that Iron Fur gets 2 extra seconds of uptime. So you're going from 7 seconds per cast to 9. That's about 28% more uptime on Iron Fur, and given that the idea here is that you're going to be hitting Iron Fur as much as you can to mitigate as much physical damage as you can, you have these other two talents here, Layered Mane, which is giving you 20% chance to get 2 stacks of iron fur per cast, and reinforced fur, which is kind of more valuable than layered mane, but you have to take layered mane to get to it. 15% more armor per iron fur. And again, that bark skin damage reduction. These 3 talents all synergize really, really nicely with Thorns of Iron, which converts casting iron fur into damage. This is great in Mythic Plus, and this really is the reason why Bear Druid is able to do so much damage in Mythic Plus. It also works really well in AoE fights and Raid, thanks to Blood Frenzy. Unfortunate that there's not a lot of AoE fights in this raid, because I think Bear Druid would be probably a top tier tank in the raid instead of being, you know, kind of like an underrated gem if there were a lot more spots for Blood Frenzy to shine and give you a lot more fuel to hit Iron Fur, you know, a ton and do a lot more damage with Thorns of Iron. But even so, Bear Druid really, really good at kind of converting AoE damage, AoE tanking into damage output, and it's really good at mitigating physical damage because of this trifecta of talents that then all funnel into Thorns of Iron. Now, there are obviously still some really important talents in here. After the Wildfire, I've talked about a bunch. Survival of the Fittest here is really good at making it so that you have Bark Skin and Survival Instincts on much shorter cooldowns. You know, that close to 45% uptime that you're getting on Bark Skin when you're running Ursoc's Endurance and Survival of the Fittest and all of this, you know, it is because of that Survival of the Fittest cooldown reduction that you're able to get that insanely high uptime. Without this, your Bark Skin uptime is going to be, you know, 12 to 14 seconds a minute. Much, much lower, much more like a normal tank defensive cooldown instead of something that's up, you know, pretty much any time that you're dealing with any kind of raid mechanic, or at the start of basically every pull in a Mythic Plus. A lot of these talents down here at the bottom of the tree, things like Scintillating Moonlight, Galactic Guardian, Incarnation, Circle of Life and Death, these are things you're going to run in any talent setup. And so now we'll take a look here at the raid talent setup that is a little bit different. It's dropping, in the left-hand tree, it's dropping Typhoon, just to be able to pick up improved Stampeding Roar, really, just a little bit more mobility for the raid. In this setup, I do have Wild Charge instead of Verdant Heart, but again, that's something that's just sort of a personal preference. And one thing I did skip over is that you can take Hibernate whenever you feel like you need that for dealing with incorporeal adds in Mythic Plus. It does not shift you out of bear form, so you can take that in a Mythic Plus setup if it's incorporeal weak. Anyway, moving on from that, over here in the right-hand tree, you can still take Ursoc's Endurance if you're in raid and you're dealing with a fight that deals a fair amount of physical damage like Neltharion. It's still a great talent for mitigating physical damage. You know, it's basically 28% more uptime on Iron Fur. Pretty good. But the extra heal charge that you get out of Innate Resolve is just kind of a nice lifeline, you know, a good safety tool that is pretty helpful, and you know, it's not reliant on any other talents to have good synergy with each other. Vicious Cycle's a really good damage increase talent. It just synergizes nicely with, you know, you're hitting Maul, you're hitting Mangle, you're hitting Maul, you're hitting Mangle, and you're adding a lot more single target damage. It doesn't really have that much value in AoE and in Mythic Plus like it does in Raid. It's kind of a negative synergy between Vicious Cycle and Thorns of Iron. You're basically taking one or the other. You're either hitting Maul offensively to dump rage and do damage whenever you're not feeling like you need to spam Iron Fur to stay alive, or you're taking Thorns of Iron so that you can hit Iron Fur as much as you can to stay alive, but also turn that into dealing direct damage. Similarly, in most of the raid situations, you're not really going to be dealing with enough enemies at a time for Blood Frenzy to generate that much rage, so you really just don't need this talent here. And instead, you're better off taking Moonless Night, which makes it so that it says your direct damage melee abilities, which the way I would read this is Mangle, Maul, Thrash, and Swipe. Those all deal direct damage. Now, Thrash deals a dot afterward, but I would think, you know, direct damage, half of it would work with this, and the dot wouldn't. And Swipe would work with this, and Right, but for some reason those two talents don't. So Mangle and Maul both work with this, and this basically just makes it so that you deal 10% more Mangle damage and 10% more Maul damage. It's okay, it's definitely not a mandatory talent. If you felt like you needed damage reduction from another source, you could take Pulverize instead, and that gives you a really strong defensive cooldown, kind of like Bark Skin, you know, very powerful. It is only single target. That's kind of the one knock against it, but it's a really strong defensive cooldown option that you can take instead of Moonless Knight if you're looking to get some more damage reduction, especially like on a burst window of damage reduction for dealing with some sort of raid boss mechanic. But Moonless Knight's just like a good fallback, add some damage, pretty simple sort of talent. Two last things I want to close out on here. The first is that Innate Resolve is poised to be changed in patch 10.1.5. It will still give you an additional charge of Frenzied Regen, but instead of just doing 20% more healing, so that instead of hitting you for 32% of your health, it hits you for like 38%, it's going to heal up to 150% more, based on how much health you're missing. So you're never going to like hit Frenzied Regen when you're at full health. And that just scales linearly. So like if you're at 50% health, it'll hit you for 75% more. So it'd be hitting for over half your health at that point. So it actually winds up being a very substantial heal in patch 10.1.5. This is kind of a talent that's fallen by the wayside in Mythic Plus because the armor talent trio here on this right side is so strong and has made it so you really don't need Innate Resolve to stay alive, and the healing amount that it adds is just so pathetic. But I think in 10.1.5, this is going to go back to being a staple talent because it's just going to provide an absolutely insane amount of healing. Also, I kind of skipped over Improved Survival Instinct. It is a talent that's seen a bit of decline. Historically, this is something you would have never thought about playing Bear Druid without 2 charges of Survival Instincts, but actually, it's pretty manageable. You can absolutely take it if you like it. If you miss it, you know, feel uncomfortable without it. But I gotta say, I've gotten pretty comfortable playing without it, and it hasn't really been a problem for me. Okay, that's it. Okay, now I want to cover rotational skills. Mangle, Thrash, and Moonfire are your most important offensive skills. You want to use Mangle whenever possible, hit Thrash on cooldown as well, and maintain the Moonfire debuff on enemies. If you have an empowered Maul cast available, thanks to Tooth and Claw, you should spend those as well. Once all of those priorities are taken care of, you want to fill any remaining spots in between with Maul if you're comfortable spending that rage offensively, or Swipe if you're trying to play defensively. The 15% damage reduction debuff that you get from Tooth and Claw won't stack and it won't extend its duration. You know, if you hit Maul with 5 seconds left on a Tooth and Claw debuff, you're going to just go back up to 6 seconds. So if you're playing defensively, you kind of want to wait until that debuff is about to fall off before you recast Maul and refresh that base duration. But if you're fine defensively, you can kind of just let those Mauls rip whenever Mangle and Thrash are on cooldown, and that'll be better for maximizing your damage. In terms of how to use Galactic Guardian procs, you actually don't want to use them manually most of the time. If Galactic Guardian procs while the Galactic Guardian buff is active, it triggers the buff just the same as if you had actually pressed Moonfire to cast it. It counts as a manual Moonfire cast. It's just piggybacked onto whatever you did that caused the proc. So you can cast Moonfire and use the proc if you're out of range, or if you really need the rage and damage right now and all you have other than that to cast is Swipe. But otherwise you're better off hitting Mangle, Thrash, Swipe, or Maul and just letting the Moonfire proc trigger on top of that and give you some free damage. The only exception here is if Galactic Guardian's about to expire in the next couple of seconds, you are better off casting it manually than just letting it wear off and wasting the proc. This is another spot where we have a 10.1.5 note. This is all no longer going to be the case in patch 10.1.5. Galactic Guardian procs will no longer consume themselves with new procs, so you want to instantly use those GG procs by manually casting Moonfire. That's not the case yet, and there's a chance Blizzard could revert it, but I wouldn't hold my breath. Alright, now let's talk cooldowns. Bear's cooldowns are kind of a window to the entire class. They're very strong, but extremely simple. Unless you're holding Incarnation or Rage of the Sleeper for a specific purpose, like dealing with a high damage phase or an ad spawn or waiting for the end of an intermission, you generally want to just use them as soon as they're available. Whenever possible, you should try and overlap those two together as well, because they will give you more value when they're combined. During Incarnation, you have two basic rotational options available. You can alternate between casting Mangle and Thrash, and this will be the best choice for dealing AoE damage and generating rage, so it's generally the best defensive playstyle. Mangle, Thrash, repeat. You can spam Iron Fur like crazy while you're doing this, and that'll give you tons and tons of stacks of Iron Fur, like 14 or more. You'll basically be unkillable by physical damage. The other playstyle option is to alternate between Mangle and Maul, and that's for maximizing your single target damage. You still want to maintain Thrash and you still want to maintain Moonfire during this time, and that's true with either setup. You're going to want to maintain Thrash and Moonfire the whole time you're tanking. But your goal during the window would be just to cast as many Mangles and as many Mauls as you can for the purposes of maximizing your single target damage output. Both playstyles work fine, and whichever approach is right for you really just is a matter of what you need at a given moment. If you need single target damage, Mangle and Maul. If you need defensive value or AoE damage, Mangle Thrash. Either way, you're going to be hitting Iron Fur a fair amount. It's just a matter of whether you're spending every point of rage you can on Iron Fur to maximize that physical damage reduction, or if you're dumping some of that rage into Maul for more priority target damage, single target damage. Now let's transition into talking about your main defensive skills as a Bear Druid. You have Iron Fur as your main defensive rage spender, and Frenzied Regeneration as your main self-heal. You will cast Iron Fur a lot. That's going to be your main rage spender the vast majority of the time. Frenzied Regen is useful when you need a big heal. It's pretty self-explanatory, but it is a useful on-demand self-heal, and it increases your healing taken while it's active, as long as you have the talent for it, Verdant Embrace or something. So that is very helpful, even if the healing number attached to it is a little underwhelming given the long cooldown it has. You also have Renewal as an off GCD self-heal. It's pretty simple, but it's very strong, basically a reusable health stone. Verdant Heart, that's the name of the talent. Now let's talk about defensive cooldowns. Incarnation and Rage of the Sleeper are both sort of defensive cooldowns. They're offensive cooldowns for sure, but they add a ton of defensive value while they're active too, which is really good. Bark Skin and Survival Instincts are your two other main defensive cooldowns. They're both very basic. If you know you're about to take a bunch of damage, you can use Survival Instincts to reduce that. That's pretty much it. Bark Skin, I mean, it works the same way, but it has really high uptime with your more defensive talent setup, and that makes it great for mitigating most of the dangerous mechanics in the raid. You know, usually they feature some sort of like big tank hit and then a long debuff damage over time effect afterwards, so if you get Bark Skin up for that initial hit, it's still gonna keep you safe for the majority of that dot. It's also just really, really good for making the start of dangerous Mythic Plus pulls a lot less painful. You know, that short 32-second cooldown, I mean, it makes it so that it's basically available for the start of every pull in Mythic Plus, and being able to start off with over 14 seconds of 30% damage reduction on top of all the rest of the damage reduction tools you have in your toolkit, you're like a god. You're just so tanky at the start of pulls now, which has historically been a spot where Bear Druid has really, really suffered. You know, the fact that Bear Druid doesn't have some way to on-demand generate a huge burst of rage like Prot Warrior does with charging, or charge demoralizing shout shield charge and quickly get 100 plus rage. You know, Bear Druid, your way of getting rage at the start of a pull is to Moonfire and Mangle. It's always been a problem, but the incredible strength that Bark Skin has now really helps compensate for that nicely. Now let me go over your group utility. You can take a lot of AoE crowd control abilities, and those can be very useful when dealing with some of the weekly affixes in Mythic Plus. Ursol's Vortex is amazing for spiteful ads. Innervate is great for helping out your healers, and unlike at the start of the expansion, it no longer shifts you out of bear form. Hibernate can be really useful during incorporeal weeks, and it also will not shift you out of bear form to cast, so it is a good option if you don't have a better choice in your group for dealing with those ads like Monk Paralysis or Demon Hunter Imprison or something that's instant and a little bit easier to cast than actually having to hard cast Hibernate. I've already mentioned it a bunch, but After the Wildfire is an amazing source of group healing. It basically is like having a healing tide totem around most of the time, at least during your incarnation, when you're really able to pump out a ton of Iron Furrows really quickly. You really are basically just a raid healing cooldown. But even outside of those windows, you still provide a lot of healing. You take a lot of pressure off the healer, a lot of pressure off all the people in the group, and you know, you just make the game easier for everybody around you. What's better than that? Okay, now we should talk about how to pull on a Bear Druid, because I think this is one of the most important things that every tank player, you know, wants to have a good handle on. It's probably the hardest part of any pull for a tank. If you have Incarnation available, that makes things way easier. You run into melee range, you hit Thrash and Mangle and pop Incarn and Rage of the Sleeper, then Thrash, Mangle, Thrash, Mangle, Thrash, Mangle, and you hit Iron for a whole bunch while you're doing that. If you need to cast Frenzied Regeneration at any point to get your health stable, you do that, but otherwise that Thrash Mangle train just keeps rolling. If you don't have Incarnation available, you just want to run in, cast Thrash and Barkskin as your first offensive skills in melee range, and you want to hit Mangle, Swipe, whatever, until you get Mangle and Thrash available again, and just try to hit those as much as you can. It's pretty simple. In any case, you want to apply Moonfire to everything in a pull that you can, but hitting skills like Thrash and Mangle to deal direct damage are more important early on in a pull to establish that initial threat, since they will deal more upfront damage and thus generate more threat than the initial hit of a Moonfire. Now, if we're talking about a single target tanking situation, you know, you're pulling a boss in a Mythic Plus or in a raid, you start out by hitting Taunt and Moonfire while you're still getting into melee range, and then Thrash and Mangle as soon as you've gotten into melee range. You want to get as many GCDs as you can into that Taunt window, because Taunt effects, or I guess Growl for Bear Druid, but Taunt effects do increase your threat dealt to that target during the 3 seconds that they're active, so getting the Mangle and Thrash in that taunt window is pretty important for holding that initial threat. In terms of stats, Bear Druids want to enchant and gem for versatility as their main secondary stat, and then haste as your second best secondary stat. So for crafted gear, you would do versatility haste. For gems and enchants, you would do versatility. Agility is very valuable, so maximizing your item level is typically the most important aspect of gearing, with secondary stat balance being, you know, secondary. You do want to get tier set bonuses, that is important and worth giving up some item level to do so if needed. Alright, before I wrap things up here, I just want to say that I'm really looking forward to patch 10.1.5 for Bear Druids. I think it's going to be a really awesome time. One of the best moments in Bear Druid history, at least in modern memory. I think that the new patch and the talent reshuffle is going to open up a lot of possibilities for the class that just haven't existed in the current talent configuration or in the talent configuration that existed earlier in the expansion. And I'm very excited for potentially seeing a huge increase in damage output and, you know, also potentially seeing some really strong new defensive talent setups. All right, that's it. Bear Druid's already really fun and strong, and it looks like it's just going to be getting a lot better pretty soon. I'm very excited about that. Thanks for watching. Bye.